You know Matthew Hulbert, of course. It's
Mm-hmm.
the new year, and here he is, the Elliott Associate Professor of History at Hampden-Sydney College and Series Editor of American Wars and Popular Culture at LSU Press. Matthew, I might have a book, by the way, that I want to propose to you, and if you could use a little bit of muscle, I am more than happy to bring a Navy Colt from the 19th century to threaten some people to get my book across the finish line. If you know Matthew from Beyond the Bushwhackers, you also know that his research revolves around 19th century America with special interest in the American Civil War, guerrilla warfare in the western borderlands, memory, film, and the western frontier. We bring him back. I gave you his full bona fides this time because, it's a new year and it's a new day. Happy New Year to you, Matthew.
You too, man. It's good to be back in action. How you doing?
I don't have any complaints. I still feel like that, being down here in New Orleans in this particular neighborhood puts me in the Wild West to some degree. And you and I have kind of danced around today's topic. We've actually made mention of it, but never really got into the particulars. And given some of the people in our chat room, I can't wait to hear what they have to say because today, folks, we're talking about, well, the hardware, the artillery, the smoke wagon, as Kurt Russell calls it.
Oh, geez, please don't.
Yeah, yeah. But by the way, I know you are not the biggest fan of that movie. I understand that, but how about
Oh no, that movie's great.
uh,
That line is
uh,
just, it didn't need to be there.
go to work, go to work. I know, I know, I know. We're talking about pistols today. Um, Is this in many ways the beginning of the proliferation of arms across the United States in regards to like what I call fancy pants stuff for the common man? I don't know. I'm asking a question I don't know the answer to. That's not even a speculation.
I mean, this is so. It kind of depends on if we're obviously distinguishing handguns, or at this point in history, just revolvers. We're not quite to the 9/11 or the 1911, which is just going to change everything yet. But in previous centuries, long arms are ubiquitous in American society. It's nothing like, don't imagine the way guns are today, where there are sort of the people who have them and the people who don't, and the people who don't think the people who do should. Guns are just guns, and they're there because we're frontier people, and they're tools, and you need them and you use them, whether it's for hunting or defense or for militia service. Um, but later, when we get into this period that we're calling the Wild West, this sort of tight little mythical window, revolvers have become sort of the stock in trade or the signature weapon of gunfighters. I don't know the extent to which we would say that's actually true. I think just as much probably happens with lever guns, but I don't think everyday people look at Westerners with pistols and think, oh man, those gun nuts, because I think from the beginning of American history up to, I don't know if we go into the 1880s or 90s today, guns are just there. I mean, they're just gun people.
Yeah, and it's interesting too because I was, it's funny. I have a lot of friends. I know you do too, who are really, really what I would call peevish, skittish, nervous around any sort of firearms, no matter what kind of firearms they are. And I have friends, by the way, who literally are armed to the teeth and could probably hold out for more than a couple of days if anybody came for them. And one of the things that I've often kind of wondered about is people don't understand too the reason why people fight the urge to have guns in cities and need them in the West and the frontier and the constant movement is there's a lot of stuff out there that can kill you in the West, not just people, if you don't have a gun. And there's a lot of stuff in a city that can kill you really too quickly if things go sideways and there are guns available and present. And this is kind of the thing, too. And I think it's the beginning. I just have this thought that it is the beginning of this, but also the country is very much awash in guns after the Civil War, right? I mean, that's the other big thing,
It,
too. It's the first
yeah.
mass manufacture of weapons at that level. And suddenly the country is just washed in guns, and half the people brought their own hardware into battle, right?
Well, and it's not just that the country is awash in guns, but it's that you now have millions of men, hundreds of thousands of men who are more proficient in using firearms under pressure than they've ever been before and using them for different purposes than they've ever been before. it wouldn't have been out of the ordinary at all in the antebellum period to talk to a 10-year-old kid and see him carrying a rifle musket down the road to go shoot a deer or a hog, or because somebody said there's a bear, in the holler down the road. But that's a very different thing than hunting men or being willing to pull a gun on another human. If it's not, we have people that you can go see and talk to about that. So the Civil War sort of changes what people know how to do with guns and what they're willing to do with guns. And then tons of those guys come west and they're immediately thrown into this frontier situation. And they think, I just spent 4 years in the pressure cooker. I know how to deal with, hostile Indians or raiders from across the border or rustlers or cowboys who aren't obeying gun control laws, which is actually a thing in the West that, speaking of Tombstone, that a lot of people don't really either know about or want to know about, because it sort of ruins the mystique that everybody just, straps on their Colt and goes walking down to the grocery store.
Yeah, well, because once you put people on top of each other, and once you have a three-story building, bottom is a hotel with a bar. I'm sorry, the bottom is a bar room with with gambling, and above that is 2 rooms of hotels or women of ill repute. And you mix guns into that situation, things can go sideways really fast. You get the Dodge City nightmare. You get these explosions of crime waves on top of a boom and all that. The other thing is, too, is the fact that the inuring of watching people die. It's, they often people who have been in combat will speak about this. The first person you kill never leaves you. After a while, you start stacking and you start putting notches in your rifle, and that kind of happens, too. So I'm also curious if a number of these people had no problem using these pistols because, hey, man, look, I was at Antietam. I was at Gettysburg. This is nothing. There's talk about at Gettysburg of people evaporating. They got hit by so many bullets simultaneously. And if you've seen that, the leap to killing somebody over a poker argument changes. So is that kind of what we're talking about here? That it's not just.
I think it is, although we probably have to be careful not to generalize with the majority of Civil War veterans.
Mm-hmm.
When the war ends, they put their Colt Navy, they put their Springfield or their Enfield down, and they go home and they go back to doing whatever they did before the war. But there's definitely a demographic that is changed by something inside them is changed by the war, and there's kind of a fork in the road there. It either sort of destroys you internally, and there are men who never recover. We don't talk a lot about this, but after the war, alcoholism, addiction rates, and suicide rates among veterans are through the roof because PTSD is not even part of our lexicon. It's not even on the radar yet. You're supposed to just kind of suck it up and deal with it in silence. So there are men that the war destroys, and then the other side of that fork is there are men that the war desensitizes. A lot of those men end up in the West, and then they are willing, when Kevin Costner says those of us who had the knack for it, we kept doing it. There are guys like that who are made by the war, who are desensitized to death and violence, and some of them actually do quite well for themselves because they have that particular skill set when they come to the West and they have experience. They basically, the bushwhackers that I study, you couldn't have had better training to do the things that they did after the war. They basically spent 4 years in paramilitary school.
Murdering sometimes people who had no dog in the fight. Murdering sometimes, people who, really where there was no justifiable reason to kill some of these people. And if you can do that, any perceived threat becomes a very kind of easy thing to kind of turn on. Part of what we're talking about here today, though, because we are talking about the romanticization and the myth making of the West too, is that we have talked about a lot of famous people, some of whom did a lot of the stuff that they claim to have done. Some did not. Some got written about in ways where they got turned into larger than life characters, others into sinister characters. But many of them were kind of identified romantically by the beautiful pistols that they actually had on themselves. But before we get to some of those, I did want to kind of ask you to dig into kind of what the most popular sort of guns in the West were, because you made an allusion to it already, but to kind of go into detail about what the popular guns were and why, for either reasons of cost or effectiveness, these weapons were chosen.
Sure. So when we get to the Civil War, we are still in the cap and ball era. So even though you turn on a Civil War era Western like A Man with No Name Western, and we see Clint Eastwood loading metallic cartridges into a revolver, that's not what we would have had during the Civil War. The 1851 Colt Navy and 1858 Remington Army, and there are two models of that. There's a Colt 1860. For the most part, these are either 36 or 44 caliber cap and ball weapons. They use black powder, so this is not smokeless powder. These are very dirty, smoky, noisy weapons, and the cylinders have to be loaded one at a time with the powder and the ball. But at the time, to us, we'd think, well, that pales in comparison to a Glock with an extended 22-round magazine. But at the time, these were the cutting-edge handgun technologies that were available to people. So these are the weapons that the majority of men, if you're using a pistol, that you would have during the war. So that first generation of sort of famous Westerners that we have that comes out of the Civil War, they are carrying these cap and ball revolvers. Doc Holliday, people know him sort of for carrying a Thunderer later, but he's really starting out his career as a killer with a Colt Navy. Bill Hickok carries a Colt Navy till the day he dies. These weapons later, after the advent of metallic cartridges, and that's really a Colt development, or at least they proliferate after the Colt Peacemaker is released in 1873, these older weapons can be converted to use the metallic cartridges. So a lot of people, if you had been comfortable with a Colt Navy for years and years, you didn't have to give it up just because you wanted to use the new cartridge technology. These are obviously revolvers. They're single-action revolvers until we get later in the 1870s, meaning you have to manually cock the hammer to rotate a cylinder, pull the trigger, it releases the hammer, it discharges a round, then you have to cock the hammer again. Later in the 1870s, Colt is going to come out with a double-action revolver that I believe that's the model 1878, that allows you to just pull the trigger. It's a harder trigger pull, but it cocks the hammer and rotates the cylinder simultaneously. So we've got the Colt, we've got the Remington, and those are really sort of the best known in pop culture. But there's another weapon, which is a Smith & Wesson number 3. Sometimes it's called a Schofield Model 3 because of an Army officer that made modifications to it. This is the break action or the break top revolver. So rather than popping the cylinder out of the side, this weapon actually, it has a hinge under the barrel. So it pops up and then you can remove the cylinder from a loading arm vertically. This is also a very popular weapon. It's bigger, it's bulkier. It doesn't look as Wild West to the modern eye, but Jesse James and Robert Ford carried this weapon. John Wesley Hardin carried this weapon at one point. Billy the Kid and Pat Garrett carried this weapon. And while we've talked about Wyatt Earp and the myth of his bunt line Colt before, Wyatt Earp is actually carrying a Schofield number 3 at the OK Corral. So this is sort of the Western pistol that no one knows about. But these are all 6-shot weapons, and they're really designed for accuracy and for somebody with a cool head. These are not designed as quick draw weapons. They're not what we see in Westerns from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Those quick draw holsters do not exist in the 19th century. You would look ridiculous if you had a gun down next to your knee, essentially, in the 1860s or 70s. This weapon would be up around your belt. A lot of people would have worn it across the belly, or they would have worn it butt out, meaning they would have cross-drawn, because the emphasis wasn't on how quick can I get this out and fan the hammer. It's, can I take a cool, measured, aimed shot while lead is in the air? And that's what made people like Hickok and the Youngers and the Jameses and the Earps so good at what they did.
It's interesting, too, by the way, a lot of people, and I'd love your take on this, because there's a movie that I keep thinking about as well. And I remember when I first saw it, I thought it's kind of measured, methodical laying out of the actuality of what a gunfight was. Unforgiven, for all of its meditation on violence,
Mm-hmm.
for all of its meditation on regret and what it means to kind of walk away from your past but have to return to it to find a way forward. All of that stuff is brilliant, wonderful, elegiac. But at the end of the day, it only works in the same way that Tin Cup as a movie works because it gets the golf right. And it gets the guns right in the sense that it's like there's a line at the end of the movie where he sets it up early and then they deliver on it late. He's like, I mean, you're going to die. There's bullets flying around. So I might as well take my time, steady my hand, and do some real damage as opposed to just throwing lead all over the place. And there is in that movie, if you watch the way they wear their belts, there really is a lot of what you're talking about very present in that film. Because a lot of movies, man, especially the 40s and 50s, love that whole thing of, watch me be slick, And I realized that, Sundance likes to move because it's actually moving the gun closer to him for all the sexiness in which the way Redford wears the pistol, he puts himself in a position where he can get to the gun quicker, actually, and be steady with it, is really interesting to me. And is that kind of the Unforgiven approach? Is that more why these guys were successful? You might have a lot of firepower. I actually know how to keep my heart rate down during this.
Yes. Well, I mean, the other thing is it makes sense with it. So you're going to get 6 shots, and actually, in most cases, if you're carrying a single action Colt, you're going to get 5 shots. So a Generation 1 single action Colt, so a single action Colt manufactured prior to World War One, the firing pin is attached to the hammer and it is not retractable. So for the most part, you would have worn that weapon sitting on an empty cylinder for fear that if you dropped the gun or if you jarred the hammer hard enough, it could push the firing pin forward just enough to ignite a primer, and then you're gonna shoot yourself in the foot or in the thigh, and you're not going to have a good time. So you've got 6 or potentially 5 shots in this weapon, and when they're gone, you're not just going to do a mag dump and slam in another one. You're going to either have to pull another gun or you're just done. So it made sense to take your time and to make your 5 or your 6 shots count. We really don't have any historical instances of quick draw duels in the street. Bill Hickok shoots a man in the heart, but it's not a quick draw. It's more of an 18th century duel where he basically stands there and actually uses the open sights on his weapon to take his time and to take a measured shot. Cole Younger does the same thing during the war. He reports in his memoir that he kills a man at 75 measured yards, which with open sights and a revolver, that's a hell of a long way. But he didn't do it because, he was flipping a poncho over his shoulder and seeing how quick he could dump his cylinder. So the best gunfighters in a lot of cases are the guys who are willing to keep their heart rate down, to take a breath, and to aim, realizing I might get shot in the process of doing this, but my shot is going to be a kill shot. And I'm going to end this fight, hopefully, before I have a chance to accidentally get hit by someone who's just sort of spraying and praying.
I wanted to ask you a question. You might not even know the answer to this one, although you might, because I know that you're obsessed with popular culture as well, not just now, but then. And the idea that it's like at some point somebody had to say to themselves, "Hey, we ought to make a gun that is for a lawman in the West that allows them to keep their heart rate down and to steady their nerves and to take their time and make the most of those 5 to 6 shots." Mentioning the Schofield, what Earp was carrying. How do they find out about these guns? I mean, who's the person saying, "Hey, man, you got to use this thing here"? I mean, because we're not talking about marketing like Nike, where you go into inner city neighborhoods, find the most popular kid, and give him the shoes. I mean,
but in a way we are.
Oh,
actually.
Here we go. Okay.
Colt and Winchester and these other prominent Smith & Wesson, these other Remington, these other prominent firearms manufacturers, they have traveling salesmen or they have traveling advertisers who basically go from town to town and set up like a little shooting gallery. This is going to seem ridiculous. Back to the Future Part 3 actually has kind of a decent representation of what this would look like. The guy has a Colt Peacemaker. He sets up the little shooting gallery, and people can step right up and see the merchandise. Winchester is particularly famous for doing this with their rifles, and then you make sure that the right people carry your weapon. Nobody knows what weapon I'm carrying when I'm on a random cattle drive. Everybody knows what weapon Wyatt Earp carries. Everybody knows what weapon Bat Masterson carries or Bill Hickok carries. And sometimes these men are actually paid to be in advertisements. So we don't have social media or digital mediums, but it is similar to how we would use influencer culture and advertising today. If the guy who you assume is the best man with a pistol carries this pistol, there must be a reason I want one too.
Well, it's interesting too because there is, like I said, another version of Unforgiven that we can actually tease the whole thing out. I mean, in Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, he's got the chapter on cool hunters. So you could see, here's a game for you. Eastern Reporter comes out, writes a story about the fastest guy in the known universe when it comes to a Navy Colt. He goes back to New York, writes his pulp stories, writes his magazine articles. Somebody from the gun company sees the story and says, hey, why don't we send one of our representatives out there and talk to this guy and see if we can put a gun in their hand? And then all of a sudden you got a newspaper. This is the gun that Wyatt Earp uses. I'm playing with a lot of time zones here, and I don't mean time zones in terms of changing time zones. I'm talking about time periods. But you can begin to see, and like I said, I've always thought that the history of the United States is the history of marketing. Because I don't think it exists in any other form until we really get to us. In many ways, you make that case, and this feels like the beginning of selling guns as I don't want to call it a fetish, but selling guns as an accessory and not just a necessity.
Well, and it's probably a little bit of both because guns in the West are everywhere. If you can afford it, you might as well have a little bit of style or kind of a little panache in the process. But they are very shrewd in how they market these weapons. So, for instance, everybody knows that the 1873 Colt or the Colt Single Action Army or the Colt Peacemaker, whatever we want to call it, everybody knows the Colt 45 or the 45 long Colt, even though there really isn't a short Colt. It's a 45 Colt. Now, when Colt is marketing this weapon, the 45 is a new metallic cartridge, and it's very popular, and it's a big bore cartridge, so it's known as sort of a man killer. This is going to put a man down better than a 36 or a 32 or even a 41 caliber might, but they want it distinguished from the 45 Schofield, so the legend of the 45 long Colt is born, and Winchester, because they are trying to compete with Colt in the firearms market, refuses to ever chamber a Winchester 1873, the most famous lever-action rifle in the West. They will not chamber it in 45 Colt because Colt owns that space already. Eventually, this forces Colt to release a version of the Peacemaker known as the Frontier model in 4440, which is what the Winchester 1873 is chambered in. So they go back and forth with each other the same way Adidas and Under Armour and Nike would today, or the way Apple and Microsoft do about compatibility. Oh, well, you're getting a little too popular. I'm not going to chamber my new weapon in your signature cartridge because I'm not going to help you. There's a lot more that goes into this than just let's all grab our guns at, Danny DeVito. So I started blasting. There's a whole culture and a whole industry around this that I don't think a lot of people realize because we just assume these are bearded guys and it's dusty and they had guns. The guns just sort of magically appear. There's a very elaborate process for how those guns appear.
Really quickly, Matthew, we're going to run out of time here. I knew this would happen. We're going to have a part 2 of this. Let's just pencil in next time. There's a whole bunch of stuff, and you and I can talk over the month and figure out how we're going to kind of unpack where we go with this. But Steve has a question. Were the bullets then rimfire, and what about misfires? You answered a little bit about the misfire with the legs and all that, but in regards to the reliability too, was that part of the advertising campaigns? We misfire less. How much of a problem were misfires? Were hands getting blown off? Because that comes up in Unforgiven. And the other thing is Trucker Bosun dropped in a .357 Smith & Wesson 8-inch rifle-barreled revolver, by the way, is one of the things that made Paranormal Pie Man go, revolver, like a Homer Simpson over a donut. But I mean, in regards to that, how much of a problem were misfires in any sort of
Well,
shootouts?
so there's a difference between a misfire and a chain fire. A misfire means however you've primed your weapon, whether it's with black powder and a primer or a cartridge that has an integrated primer, didn't ignite well enough to, send your cartridge down the barrel. Ammunition, it depends on where you got it, the quality of the powder, how was it stored. So a lot of people wouldn't blame the firearm necessarily for the quality of their ammunition, but why people trust Colt so much and the Peacemaker, it goes through extensive testing to get the right thickness of the chamber walls of the cylinder to cut down on what would be called a chain fire, meaning shooting one round ignites the primer and the others, and if they all go off at once, only one can go down the barrel, then the gun is going to blow up in your hand and you're going to lose some fingers. That's part of why Colt becomes such a trusted brand, because they're known for reliability and they're big, they're bulky. You just think this thing's not going to be a little grenade in my hand. There are rimfire rounds. 44 Henry is a rimfire, a very popular early lever action rimfire round. There are pistols chambered for that. But by the time we get into the post-Civil War era, center fire cartridges, the 45 Colt, the 44-40, the 38-40, the 32-20, there's a 44 Russian, a 44, and a 45 Schofield. The Schofield is a little shorter than a 45 Colt, so to distinguish it, that's why we start calling the Colt 45 the long Colt. You can shoot 45 Schofield in a 45 Colt. You can't shoot a 45 Colt in a 45 Schofield. That's more than the question asker wanted to know, but the answer to the question is we've got both, but center fire is becoming more and more popular because it is more reliable than rimfire.
By the way, I'm telling you, I know Steve, and I'm sure Steve is delighted to get that in-depth of an answer. That's what you can expect from MatthewChristopherHulbert.com. Head on over there and find out about the Elliott Associate Professor of History at Hampden-Sydney College and Series Editor of American Wars and Popular Culture at LSU Press. Hang out just for a second when we go to the commercial break. I want to tell you something before you get out of here. His research, by the way, in case you can't tell, is about the American Civil War, guerrilla warfare in the Western borderlands, memory film in the Western frontier. And by the way, we are moving beyond the bushwhackers, and we'll continue our conversation about the hardware, the artillery, and the ordnance that was the Wild West. Thank you, Matthew, so much.